everybody, and welcome to another episode of Typology. Today, I have a very special guest with us today is Jason Smith. He's a podcast host and media commentator. I was just on his pod, The Bridge to China, and he's also the author of A World Beyond Poverty, which is a book about the Belt and Road. It's been great being on Jason's show, and now I get to ask the questions, Jason. How about that?
This is really exciting for me, yeah.
Yeah. So can I just ask you how you got interested in China? Like your basically your life is talking about China, learning about China, communicating about China. But where did you come from, and how did you become interested in China in the first place?
You know, I never set out to become a China expert. That wasn't my goal, and I don't think I'm a China expert. I'm just a Californian living in China. When I got my master's degree, I studied world history. I actually studied India, mostly imperialism and India. And then I finished my master's degree, and I thought, you know, I'm from the United States, and it's very common for people from the United States. I've never seen anywhere except North America. So I actually moved to South Korea. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the right fit for me. So I went back to San Francisco, and then I was like, oh, I really do want to stay abroad. And I was like, well, what about China? You know, there are all this economic data showing that China is going to be the next world power economically. And I thought, that's interesting. I'll go to China.
When was that?
I moved to China my first trip to China was 2010, and then I moved to China in 2012, July 4th, America's Independence Day. And I really loved it. I fell in love with China. I was like, wow. Actually, after a couple of years of being here, people were like, Jason, didn't you say were you going to go see the world? Why are you still in China? And, you know, the answer I give myself is I love it here so much. I've traveled to a lot of other countries since having moved here. Japan, Philippines. I went back to South Korea. I've been to a few other countries elsewhere. But I really just love it here. So I just stayed, and I got stuck.
You know, China is a world in itself. That's my feeling after going there a few times. And you've seen much more of it than I have. Apparently you've been to every province.
Yeah, I've been to every province. I've been to Xizang, also known as Tibet, a few times. I've been to every special administrative region. I've been everywhere. It was a goal of mine around 2000. I was like, you know what? I want to see everything. So around 2022, when, you know, the pandemic was starting to lighten up a bit, I started just traveling everywhere. I'd already been to a few provinces, but now I've been everywhere. And many places I've been many times. I've been to Xinjiang every year for a few years. I've been to Xizang every year for a few years. I go to Hebei often. Shandong I've been to 24 times. I go to Dongbei quite a bit. I've been to Harbin 3 times, twice for the Ice Festival. China is beautiful, and no matter how much I've traveled, which is a lot, I haven't even seen like 5% of what there is actually to see.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I feel like that's the whole new adventure that's in front of me to learn about all the different corners of China, and I feel very excited because as a Taiwanese person, when I go to the mainland, that is also my country. That is my country. It's just, I never thought about it that way before. So it's like something that's both completely new to me and it's mine. So it's all very, very exciting. How did you end up doing the work that you're doing?
You know, I used to work for Disney. I can't say more than that because I have an MBA.
Okay.
But during the pandemic, Disney closed down. A lot of Disney closed down. Not the parks and some of the stores, but a lot of other parts of Disney shut down. And I went to work as a kindergarten teacher for 2 years. 1 year in Beijing and then 1 year in Wuhan, because it paid a lot more to go to Wuhan all of a sudden, as you might imagine, as a foreigner. A lot of foreigners had jumped out of China. And, you know, I just want to go back to what you just said about China being your country. I just want to say, because I think it's important to say that, you know, China is not my country. I love it, and I consider China home in a way, but I just want to point out the fact that, you know, I'm not trying to be Chinese. I am an American. I'm a Californian living in China. So I just want to, you know, point that out, that no matter how long I'm here, I am always just a guest in China's house. But after I was a kindergarten teacher, or actually at the same time I was a kindergarten teacher, my wife, who is very eager for me to do more, she was like, hey, you're always saying nice things about China. Why don't you do that in front of a camera instead of in front of your buddies? And I was like, okay, sure. And I did that. The first video we released had like 100,000 views on Bilibili. And
Wow.
people really loved what I had to say. So I started making content for a Chinese audience. What does an American think about being here? For a Chinese audience, Xiaohongshu, Bilibili, Douyin, and so forth. I very rapidly gained a couple 100,000 fans. Within a couple of months, it was very fast. Because, a lot of people had left, and I was one of the few voices left who were still here and still having a great time. And so, later, I got approached by various media groups who said, hey, why don't you do that for us? And I could just have one job. I could just make media. That sounds great. And so now I work for China Global Television Network Radio. And I have a radio show that broadcasts in cities with a total combined population of about 130 million people. That does not mean 130 million people listen to me. I kind of think of it like this. When I was in California, there was always that Spanish channel on the radio,
Yes.
right? Mm-hmm. So I'm like the equivalent of that in China. I'm on the one English talk radio channel in China. But I'm about 1/6 of that channel because my show plays 4 hours a day out of 24 hours.
Wow. That's awesome. I was on that show, so broadcast all over.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. No, that's a great story, and I feel like you've seen China. You lived in China at a very consequential time in China's development. And it's a time when a lot of foreigners did leave. I would like to ask a little bit more about that. What caused that exodus? Was it a push or a pull? Did China change in a way that made life more inhospitable? Did it become more hostile to foreigners? Why did so many people just... and I talk to them because they come to Taiwan. Maybe they were a former journalist. Maybe they used to do business there. And they always want to talk about, the good old days in Shanghai. It was so easy to make money and it was so easy to... So what changed and why were you okay to stay? Why are you continuing to stay in China?
Well, I want to give a longer answer to this because it's very complex. And I think that there are this is the source of two different narratives about China. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's thousands of narratives about China. I'm simplifying. But when I arrived in 2012, from 2012 to 2016, it seemed static to me because I wasn't really paying attention to what was really going on. It didn't make sense to me until later. But I just want to point out that in 2012, China was not the amazing place that it is today. There was street crime. There was homelessness. There was prostitution that was visible. There were people doing drugs, mostly foreigners. There was a lot of alcoholism, mostly foreigners, a lot of bars filled with foreigners, complaining about China, but there were, a lot of the journalists went to places like Sanlitun and other places to get drunk and complain about China together. And I was just like, oh, okay, this is just what it is. This is, I assumed that this is the static China that I was existing in. But things really were changing, and it became more apparent later. But before I get to how it changed, I want to point out around 2018, the period between 2017 to 2019, firstly, a lot of foreigners went home in a non-voluntary kind of way. And most of those foreigners were not qualified to actually be in the positions that they were in. So China cracked down really hard, really suddenly on especially English teacher types who didn't actually have bachelor's degrees, didn't have certificates to teach children, some of them had criminal records. China didn't have a very complex, sophisticated system for filtering out whose documents were fake. A lot of people printed their bachelor's degrees on printers and just put stamps on them and stuff. So China finally, around 2017 to 2019, got rid of all of these foreigners who didn't actually belong in the positions that they were holding. At the same time also, there was something called the double reduction policy, which was the elimination of after-school programs that were expensive and unnecessary, especially English programs, which were making meritocracy untenable because a lot of wealthy people were paying for these very expensive classes. And so basically all of these after-school programs that were expensive were eliminated. Not just English, but other programs as well. And this meant even some qualified foreigners had to leave because there weren't enough positions for the people who were living here to continue to stay. So a lot of them left. So the population reduced to about 200,000 or 300,000 Western foreigners living in all of China suddenly. And then around, I guess, January 2000, pandemic struck. And people were frightened. This happened during Chinese New Year that people became aware. I was in Yantai Shandong, and I remember, I need to go home to Beijing in case the trains stop. What if they lock down the country? I don't know. So I got on the train the next morning after we heard that this had broken out in Wuhan, not understanding or knowing what was coming. I just wanted to get to my house so that if there was some kind of lockdown, I was in my own home. Because, we've been, all of us all over the world have been watching movies like 28 Days Later and all of these scary movies about viruses. And, no one knew what was going to happen. But a lot of foreigners had gone home for Chinese New Year. That's what a lot of foreigners were doing.
They just didn't come back.
They went to the States. They went to Canada. They went to Australia. They went to the Philippines. They went home. And then this happened. And most of them, the vast majority, 9 out of 10, just never came back. And so some of them worked remotely for a month or two before they were let go by various firms. A lot of firms shut down. A lot of companies shut down, especially companies reliant on foreigners. And then we ended up with and then people were still leaving. Every flight that they could, a lot of foreigners who wanted to get out left. So and I posted something like this story, but what really happened was people who consider China their home, in some respect, or they were married or tied to the land in some way, stayed. People with really big financial investments. I posted this and someone insulted me saying, hey, how dare you say that those people who went home didn't really love China? And I responded, and I'm going to say this and I think still believe it, yeah, they went home. So for them, home was Texas, right? For me, home was still here. So, I lost my job too. But you know what I did? I found another job in my home, which is China. So I remained here. A lot of other people remained here. What really happened was a great filtering event. There were 3 different filters. 1, get rid of all of the people who weren't qualified. Just with that one thing, alcoholism among foreigners dramatically dropped. So there was a very few foreigners going to the pubs and getting ridiculously drunk, which was the good old days. When I think of the good old days that some foreigners describe, I think drugs, alcoholism, prostitution. China cracked down on all of that stuff very seriously. There was one night in 2016 or 2017 when the police arrested almost every person selling marijuana in all of Beijing at the same time. A lot of foreigners were really upset about that. They were like, oh my gosh, this is so draconian. But for some of us, it was there's a lot less alcoholism. There's a lot less prostitution. There's a lot less. That was really nice. This is becoming a more family-oriented place. And so actually, I don't think of those as the good old days. I think of this transitional period as a wonderful thing. But there were other things going on too. For example, when I arrived, there are all these construction sites all over Beijing, all over Shenyang, all over Qingdao, all over Yantai, all over many cities all over China. By 2019, 2020, 2021, they weren't construction sites anymore. They were shiny silver towers, reaching up into the heavens. And China, the air got clean because there was this process of cleaning the air and the water and the river chief system where people were in charge of managing water in a new way in China. There was a massive regreening. 78 billion trees have been planted in China since 1981. Massive solar investments, massive investments in EVs. China transformed over this period. It was really hard to see it in the first few years that I was here. But by 2021, 22, 23, you could see, blue skies the vast majority of the time. Is that true all the time? No, it's not. There are still gray sky days. But it's so much better. It's 1,000 times better than it used to be. And now when you walk around in places like Beijing, you can see the license plates. They're green or blue. Blue means, internal combustion engine cars, and green means EVs, or NEVs as China calls them. And they're about half of the cars you see in Beijing now have green license plates. The skies are blue. There's no construction pits anymore. There's no prostitution. There's no drug use. Very little alcoholism. Homelessness is gone because there's, the poverty alleviation campaign was completed in 2020. And then you have all of the rural revitalization where entire villages have been invested in and rebuilt and all over the country. Like it's not just the cities, it's the rural areas too are considerably enhanced. One of the things I do, the book you mentioned is about China helping other countries out of poverty, and the investments they make in other countries. I'm working on a different book now about internal poverty alleviation, and there's just been so much investment. China spends 1 trillion RMB every single year just on infrastructure. There's just been a sea change. And so we have the emergence of two bell curves of narratives. Those people who knew this old China, right? And their perception of China is, homelessness and poverty and alcoholism and all these things that existed in gray sky days. And then there are all the people that stayed, or the new people who are coming, who are usually much more highly qualified. And those people are seeing blue skies and high tech and robots and flying cars and low altitude economy. So you have two different lenses of China, one that's outdated and, relatively dystopian, and one that is very contemporary and actually is starting to win because reality always wins. And China, the reality is it's hyper modern now.
Yeah, well, Jason, actually, thank you for that, because I've always, before learning more about China and going to China myself, I always felt this tremendous sense of FOMO, because for a lot of people that I talk to, 2010, that was peak China. That was when things were so good. And Angelica, you missed out on the scene. You missed out on the vibes. You missed out on this little brief window when China was cool. And now it sucks because everything got closed down and everything got really draconian. And China is just now eternally stuck in this unfree, terrible state. And I'm just like, well, I went there and it's beautiful, and I don't think I missed out on all that much, maybe. And it's true, isn't it? Like, what you think about China depends so much on when you were really there and what your values are, what you find interesting. I think what it is also is it's not such an easy place for foreigners to go and just make money anymore, because they have the foreign connections, or they can teach English, or they can do business in a way that's perhaps not just even like for people who are in things like luxury, right? They don't find the Chinese consumer as vulnerable to, like, oh, it's foreign, so I have to buy it. I have to pay a big premium anymore. Like, when I went to China, I see local brands coming up and people being more interested in the thing itself rather than the story, or that people are not so blindly willing to pay for a brand anymore.
Well, I think that's really true. Actually, there were a lot of, firstly, knockoffs that existed. So, a lot of the things that we hear people say about China who haven't been here in a long time were really true about that time. I think it's really interesting that these people who left China 10 years ago, who are on YouTube making content, they're doing historical service because they're talking about a China that did once exist. But most of those people don't really understand what China is like today. And really, in terms of consumerism, when we're talking about products, Chinese products are really high quality now. And I think that... Hello?
Jason, you're stuck a little bit. Is your network okay?
One sec. How's that? Is that better?
You're not lagging anymore, so we'll try it. Don't worry. I'll try to cut out the bit, and you can just start at a natural place.
Let me change. Am I not lagging, right?
You're stuck again.
Hello. Sorry about this. I'm switching between VPNs. How's that?
Yeah, that's better. That's better.
Okay. You know, in terms of consumption, like Chinese brands are just much more affordable. Let's talk about Starbucks, right? Just as an example. Starbucks, you go in, you pay 35 RMB for, I don't know, a cappuccino. Average. I could, depends on which size you get or whatever. Luckin, if you use the QR code and you go into the shop to pick it up yourself, it's 9 kwai 90. So you're paying a third of what you were paying for Starbucks. So, Starbucks, you're paying to sit there. You're really paying for a sitting space. Luckin is pick up and go. Chinese consumers are savvy, really savvy. They don't want to spend money if they don't have to. You could go to Dairy Queen, which exists in China, and it's like 30, 40 RMB for an ice cream. Or you could go to Mixue Bingcheng, and it's 2 RMB or 3 RMB for an ice cream. So, a lot of the Western brands that depended on being the only game in town did lose out to Chinese brands who undercut them. And Mixue is incredibly profitable. Luckin is incredibly profitable. They don't need to gouge people for money, which is why Starbucks actually sold its controlling interest to a Chinese company. Now, when you buy Starbucks in China, a very small amount of that revenue actually goes to the company in the United States. Most of it's going to Chinese investors now. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Also, Yum Brands, which provides KFC and other fast food in China, exists everywhere. You can get Pizza Hut, McDonald's, and all of this stuff, but a lot of those are controlled by Chinese companies, which actually own a controlling interest in those companies as well. So there are smaller scale businesses like people who own cafes and bars and things like that in China, but they tend to be owned by 1 or 2 or 3 people. But what you were just pointing out, the time when someone could just show up as an English teacher and say, I have a bachelor's degree, pay me 1,000 RMB an hour, are gone. So yep. I think in terms of the gouging of the Chinese middle class, yes, it does seem to have evaporated.
Yeah, and I just feel like after COVID especially, a new China just almost uncloaked in front of me because before that, because especially during COVID, there was so little communication coming out, and obviously it was very difficult for people to go to China, and a lot of journalists were getting kicked out. So there was lack of visibility, and it seems like everything we heard from China was bad. Of course, we know China bad news is an industrial complex. So it was a very easy time for people to fill the vacuum of news with their own narratives, which are very negative. And during the pandemic, I believed in the Uyghur genocide thing because in the absence of information, it's very easy for those narratives to seem convincing. But then the China that emerged after COVID lifted, my goodness, you just hear one thing after another that changes your perspective. I worked a lot covering energy at the time, and it's whether it's offshore wind or solar photovoltaic or nuclear, it just seems like China was doing like above and beyond work, and they were doing just how are they leading in so many different technologies. And you just hear all these things, and then the visa-free program started. It's just insane. People are starting to realize, I just feel very, very humbled by it, and wondering how we got it wrong for so long. But it's very exciting, and it's like hard work over a long time paying off. I always think about how one way China surprised me was how they stood up to America during the Trump trade tariff wars. And the rare earth card they ended up playing, they started their first rare earth lab in 1983. So it's been something that's been cultivated for so long, and I think it demands a rethink. China's emergence really demands a rethink by the rest of the world for how we think about the economy, how we think about governance systems and how they work. But I feel like America's gone they've gone straight from saying, well, China's doomed because they're not doing things our way. They're not listening to our neoliberal gospel. China's doomed never to reach its potential. China is doomed to collapse in this, that, or the other way, and it's totally unnecessary, and it's very sad, and it's because communists are stupid and they don't know what they're doing. They've gone straight from that to, oh my God, China is a threat. We have to take China down because China is going to be really, really strong, a very formidable opponent. And if they become stronger than the United States, then the world we live in would cease to exist. And just like those two narratives are opposite, right? You know, one minute you're saying what the Chinese are doing can't work. The next minute you're saying the Chinese are cheating by doing, industrial policy or us. It just seems like I'm getting ideological whiplash, but everybody else seems to just be rolling with it. And now the narrative's changing again. It's like from we have to take China down by any means necessary to, oh yeah, maybe we can't. Maybe we'll just go to Beijing and make a deal. And it's just very, very interesting to me how there can be so many shifts in position without reflection and maybe like a conscious retooling of what assumptions we're making, adjusting our priors or anything like that. It just seems like everybody should take a break and have a think and absorb this new information.
You are so rational compared to the average think tanker in the United States. I don't think that they're capable of that level of cool-headedness. I'm glad to hear that you put it so subtly in so many different kinds of ways, and you're analyzing the complexity of the issue. I really think the problem is partially from a lack of correct information. Because, if you're in Washington, D.C., and you're a China expert, but you haven't been to China in 20 years, you're relying on the information that other people are providing you about what China's really like. And, I actually think this is a huge problem for the United States. The vast majority of people who teach about China, firstly, are not Chinese, didn't come to China, didn't get a university degree in China, or only go to China for a periodic trip every now and then. I think not just about China, I think area studies professionals in the United States are it's a racket for people who wanted to get their PhD at Stanford and now have a job at Princeton or wherever it is. And they just are relying on this as a source of income. And then they're reading books written by other Westerners combined with a couple of people from Asia. And then they're making all of these crazy assumptions. I think that the entire university think tank system in the West, especially in and around Washington, D.C., needs to be expunged in some way or shape or form and replaced by people who, and I'm not talking about me. This is not a personal thing. I don't have a degree from a university in China. I think that needs to be replaced by people who have degrees from universities in China. If we're going to understand China, we need people who understand China. And that means having a degree from, Tsinghua University or Fudan University or some other university here in China, a master's degree or a bachelor's degree. At least one of your three big degrees, bachelor's, master's, or PhD, needs to have been done in China. So the people who are advising our Washington politicians are more informed about what China is actually like. A lot of people, politicians included, who are making these huge assumptions about what China is like, are like getting their information from news pundits who, like you said, think 2010 were the good old days. And those people are informing think tanks. They're informing the population. They're creating an echo chamber of misunderstanding, disinformation, and bad assumptions about what China is, what China is not. And China is not any of those things at all, really. And China is so complex. We really need our experts coming to China now. President Xi Jinping a few years ago said he wanted 50,000 U.S. students to come to China to study in Chinese universities or high school. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Not for China. I mean, I'm not even thinking about what's in China's best interest. I mean, that's a whole other issue. I'm thinking about what's in the U.S. best interest. We need Americans who understand what China's like, good, bad, gray areas, whatever it is, so that they can actually be informed decisions being made in Washington, D.C. Your point about them just jumping around from conclusion to conclusion is what's happening in the media. And then there are just some people like Laura Loomer or Gordon Chong, or, by the way, there's a good Gordon Chong. There's Gordon G. Chong, insane person, and there's Gordon H. Chong, professor at Stanford, amazing, wonderful historian.
So if they meet, does the universe disintegrate because they're the Gordon Chang and the anti-Gordon Chang?
Yes. It's like antimatter touching itself. There's going to be a huge explosion. But, China is complex. We need to spend more time before we make assumptions about what we should do with policy. There need to be more visits. And people like Marco Rubio, who were banned from China until his trip just recently with Donald Trump, they don't know anything. I mean, these people don't know anything. I'm glad, Donald Trump is complex. He's a lot of things, good and bad, but I'm glad he came to Beijing. I'm glad that him and President Xi got together and they shook hands and said, let's have peace. But at the same time, back in the United States, there are a lot of people like Senator Tom Cotton or Laura Loomer or all of these people who are saying just insane things that don't make any sense at all about how China wants a war with the United States or China wants to invade Taiwan or China wants to invade Japan. None of this is true. I'm an American, but, we invade a lot of countries all the time. Nonstop wars. China hasn't had a war in like 47 years since a 1-month-long conflict in the 1970s with Vietnam. China is not, a military threat. Does it have a powerful military? Yes, that is for defense against, external threats, but it hasn't been used in half a century. China is not interested in war. China is interested in literal bridges, building bridges, actually literally building bridges in other countries. There are 8 China-Bangladesh friendship bridges. China builds friendship bridges in Angola and Mali, in Laos, and countries all over the world where China is actually building hospitals and schools and bridges as part of its diplomatic profile. I mean, we could say that's bad or good. Some people might say, oh, this is a bribe. Okay, sure. If you want to bribe a place with hospitals and save tens of thousands of lives, that's okay with me, personally. I think that's a nice bribe. Or the 1,000 schools for oil in Iraq, or whatever China is building around the world. I think those are great things. Those are helping real people live better lives. I think China's diplomacy is amazing. And if it's, doing the disservice of creating goodwill towards China, and that's the worst you can come up with, I think that's great. I think America should learn from China. America should be building bridges in all of these countries too, and hospitals and schools and so forth. But, one thing China is not an obvious military threat to the United States or anybody, really.
Yeah, and I'm just so sad about this because I am, an American too. And as an American, I feel just heartsick that people in China actually used to be very pro-American. I hear about this all the time. Especially in cities like Shanghai that were very cosmopolitan and international facing. Actually, it was in the mainstream opinion is to be pro-American and say, well, we've learned so much from them, we respect them, maybe there's more things we can do to improve ourselves and learn from their example. It was a very genuine respect, and they were very pro-America-philic. They were Western-philic, and really a lot of stuff had to happen to change that opinion. Even when it was during the Obama time, I was just talking to a friend in Shanghai about this yesterday. He said, even during the Obama time when they were starting to pivot back to Asia and they were trying to do the TPP, which is cutting China out, we were like, fair enough. How can we make them feel comfortable? How can we show our sincerity and create mutual trust? And do they have a point? People were still in that, bargaining stage where they're like, if we can modify our own behavior, then we can assuage American fears, and then they won't be so against China's growth anymore. But I think Trump really got them to wake up that this was just useless. There's nothing China can do short of stopping growth that would satisfy the United States that it was not a threat. And I just think that is so sad because China then, in a way, had no choice but to really turn inward and grind. And we see now Huawei's coming up with all those innovations in semiconductor manufacturing that they didn't want it. They didn't want to do this. Huawei originally didn't want to touch semiconductor manufacturing with a 10-foot pole because they were happy doing their telecom equipment stuff. They were making money. Why tackle such a hard problem? China was happy just, working on itself and doing things their own way. And it's almost like it's the American pressure to try and kneecap them that had to push them into this hyper self-reliant mode where they absolutely can make everything themselves, which ironically just makes everybody more freaked out about them. So we're now in this bad spiral where the stronger China is, the more America distrust them and feel threatened. The more America feels threatened, the more America tries to kneecap China and shut it out of the global system. And the more America does that, then the more China have no choice but to do those things themselves, even at great cost. And now America just made its worst nightmare come true, which is a China that is extremely self-reliant, but America still reliant on China for a lot of bottlenecks, and it seems like the more you try to restrict China, the stronger it's becoming. And China actually don't even want this. China just want everything to be chill. Why can't everything just be chill,
Your narrative, I couldn't say it better, so I'm not going to reiterate or attempt to reframe what you said. I think you got it exactly right. That's exactly the processes that we've been through. So I think China's also realized that placating the United States, like you said, is not realistic, that the United States is trapped in sort of an echo chamber of these sorts of ideas, these bad ideas. And maybe that's part of Thucydides' trap, America.
Yeah, Thucydides' trap, yeah.
Thucydides' trap. Can it be assuaged at this time? And I think that's why China is actually switching to focusing on its Belt and Road Initiative partners, 150 countries around the world, where China has lowered tariffs for African countries to zero. So all these African countries can now export their goods instead of to their own countrymen, maybe 10 million people, depending on the country. Now they have 700 million people that they, in China's middle class that'll be able to consume their chocolate or cocoa or whatever it is, coffee beans and other things. And I think that, the Southeast Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, Africa, Latin American partners around the world are going to continue to increase their trade with China, importing and exporting. One thing that's really happening beyond just trade, though, is the infrastructure that we see. The Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, BRICS infrastructure, bridges, ports, rail, roads, hospitals, schools. What we are seeing is a transformation of the global economy that we have not seen since imperialism started half a millennia ago. China is rewriting the international stage by including all of these previously underdeveloped countries in a global economic system, which is not seeking to, and I want Americans here to note, this is not seeking to destroy America or something. This is trying to create an alternative economy, an alternative global inclusive economy, which includes all of the countries which have been neglected, left out. The name of the book by, I think it was Walter Rodney, was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So we get this term developing countries or undeveloped countries. Well, China is actually changing that. Instead of underdeveloping Africa, China's partnership is developing Africa. Does China still take raw materials from African trade partners? Yes, absolutely. They're willing to sell those. But China's also setting up hospitals and schools, universities, and special economic zones in other places around the world, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, which is allowing skills transfers and added value to be developed in those countries so that they can enjoy more of the wealth of those raw materials. Of course, this is an African initiative as well. China is not developing Africa for it. What China is doing is helping Africans develop in the way that they want to develop. Because previously, if an African country or a developing country wanted a loan to build a bridge, they would go to the IMF or World Bank and they'd say, hey, we need $5 billion to build a bridge. Can we please have this loan? And the IMF said, yes, sure. Here's the interest. And of course, you're going to have to liberalize your banks, sell your national assets to international partners, and all of these other stipulations that come in tranches. And of course, I guess is the only way we can build this bridge. So deal. But now China is providing these loans through the China Export-Import Bank, through the Belt and Road initiative, and they have their own banks, BRICS Bank, and all of these other financial tools that are available. And when China offers a loan, they say, well, here's your concessional loan, this is the interest rate, and that's it.
That's it.
So, yeah, we're not going to buy your forests or change your banking system or interfere with your internal political system. Why? Because China was in that position in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when China needed help. When they looked to the IMF and World Bank, those are the kinds of terms that the IMF and World Bank were offering China. And China knew, we don't want to do this that happened to us to other international partners. We want to give them the kind of loans that we wish we could have had. And so now China is offering these, no strings attached loans to countries around the world, and those countries are happy to work with China. Why also Chinese companies are participating? Because China just finished developing, the best infrastructure the world has ever known for 1.4 billion people. They have the ability to build bridges and to build rail and to build roads. They have, the United States doesn't actually have the companies to do that as well, because the United States finished developing 50 years ago. So the companies that built, America don't exist in the way that they do in China. China actually has the capacity to build ports and airports and all of these things that the United States has largely lost. So China is now going around the world offering loans and then saying, if you would like this loan, would you also like this company to come and build this bridge for you? And these are decisions that have to be left up to these developing countries, but African and Southeast Asian, Central Asian, West Asian, Latin American partners are saying, yes, please, can we have some more?
Yeah, well, we say that in Chinese, right? In China, they say, if you want to get rich, build a road first. And there's just a true, incredibly liberating factor to having good transportation. I saw one clip where all these eggs were going over these roads and in trucks, and a bunch of them would break, right, because the road was so bad. And as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, they got a new road. Now the eggs don't break, and that is just extra productivity that's going to get compounded over time. So, and there's new connections that business that wasn't able to be done are now made possible. So. I think it's a very exciting initiative, and it holds the possibility that maybe Africa can break out of its cycles of poverty. I mean, obviously, all those Western NGOs going in and IMF, they've had their time to try and make Africa develop, and it obviously was not happening. So maybe at least they should be open to letting China, letting people try it China's way. I think that's really the least they can do. And I feel like it's already starting to bear fruit, because the Belt and Road project, I feel like when it was announced, everybody was so skeptical about it. People thought it was a pie in the sky. People thought it was very unrealistic. And then you went through a part of the cycle when people are saying, oh, it's all debt traps. It's all like the Chinese trying to snooker these third world countries into building bridges to nowhere. And then it got to the place where, oh, it's failing. The number of projects are plummeting. Those poor countries they're defaulting on their loans. And if you look into the individual cases, there were bad projects. There were projects that were unable to be funded. There were projects where they were unable to collect. So individually, there were bad projects, but at a certain point, the actual contours of the project as being a success kind of just revealed itself, and you realize, okay, yes, you can cherry pick all those bad projects and make it look a certain way, but actually this is a program with a pretty transformative effect on the world. I mean, you wrote the book about it. Can you tell us a little more about how this project was conceived, and when it started to look like it's going to be a real success?
Well, I like the phrase that you use, transformative effect. Before I talk about my book, I'm going to talk about someone else's book. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs wrote a book in around 2006 called The End of Poverty. And in this book, he outlines that countries, in order to modernize themselves, self-generating modernization, to approach, becoming at least a middle-income country and move towards becoming a developed country, need basically 6 things. I'm not going to delineate all 6, but, it's basically like schools, the ability to educate yourself, infrastructure, transportation, energy, those kinds of things. If you have these inputs inside of your own country, then it will begin to self-modernize. It will begin to modernize using its own population and its own resources. And this book, I think, is really important because Jeffrey Sachs has been an important participant in China's own poverty alleviation efforts. Jeffrey has been coming here to China for a couple of decades, and he has been participating with Beijing. He actually, when you go to these forums on poverty alleviation, of which I was just at yesterday, people like Jeffrey Sachs are often sitting on the stage, very often, especially when it pertains to poverty alleviation. So he's actually been a voice that Beijing has listened to. The standing committee had meetings with him to talk to him and, drain his brain of ideas about how they could do this. Of course, they didn't just follow Jeffrey's instructions. They have their own ideas, their own perceptions of how to make China develop. But, his ideas about this transformative internal effect are very, important around the world in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. China goes into a country oftentimes. We're talking about finance and we're talking about China-aided projects. I actually prefer them to think of them as diplomatic gifts. But China calls them China-aided projects. That's when China pays for, in part or whole, entire projects. And we're not talking about 1 or 10 or 100. We're talking about thousands of China-aided products around the world. We'll call them products. Water holes for countries. And we're talking about dozens. In Togo, I think they built 305 in the last couple of years, different water well systems that are actually integrated into people's homes so people can get internal water. Hospitals, universities, Cape Verde, a country off of the coast of West Africa, they built entire universities for them. Schools, 1,000 schools in Iraq are being built right now in what is called Phase 1, but 7,000 schools will be built in Iraq by China in exchange for oil. China also gives loans, of course, through China Exim Bank and other institutions, and those are concessional usually, meaning they're 1 or 2 or 3 or 4% interest, usually with a great grace period of at least 3 to 5 years. So China is developing all of these projects, hospitals, schools. What does that mean? When you're building factories, hospitals, schools, roads, ports, you're giving them these inputs, these things that Jeffrey Sachs talked about that are required for development. When you look at poverty alleviation inside of China, let's talk about Taihe Shuijian. This is a town in Hebei province. Really poor 10 years ago, people were living in extreme poverty. By extreme poverty, we're talking borderline starvation. Today, it's opulent. Go there. It's an hour drive from Beijing. It's opulent. This little town, they have posh hotels and little ice cream and Thai cafes for like Thailand style coffee. It's an amazing little town. Everyone there is doing well. Why? Because China invested in all of the things that they need. Roads, schools, local hospital. They invested in changing people's homes, updating people's homes, renovating people's homes, building new homes. Now they're actually huge investments because they have cooperatives there where the local communities are working in co-ops and they're taking money as transfers and loans, and they're developing residential complexes nearby, trying to sell them to rich people from the city to move out there. So this idea of not just giving, in America we have welfare, right? Okay, you're poor, here's your check, right? Okay, maybe we try to help you find a job, maybe not, maybe you can't find one, whatever. China actually builds these little economies in towns, thousands of towns all over China, to create little economies where people are able to take care of themselves. They give telecommunications equipment. You said roads. They give water, the electricity, everything people need, plus training. Usually families are trained, oftentimes it's young, pretty females that are trained to do online sales for local products that they're now adding value to. They're not just growing tomatoes, they're making tomato sauce. They're not just growing apples, they're making apple sauce. They're making apple liquors. They're making apple, dried apples. They're selling them all over the nation, not just locally, but nationally, and in some cases internationally. So this is how China has alleviated poverty within its own borders. Of course, there's still more work to be done, and we're currently in the Rural Revitalization Program, which will continue for at least a decade more. But they're taking these same ideas and they're talking to partners in other countries, African countries. They're talking about, well, what do you need? You need this and this and this and this. And these are the things that you're going to need in order to provide for yourselves. Let's look at Cambodia. Was it Cambodia? Laos. China invested a lot in their hydropower system. Year 2000, 40% access to electricity throughout the entire country. Year 2019, 100% access. You're talking about broken eggs. Well, if your local town doesn't have regular access to electricity, guess what you can't have? Industry. So now they can get international partners, whether it's China or someone else from France or Germany or the United States or whatever, to invest in local potential factory building. Why? Because they have access to electricity and labor. So, I mean, these places that China is helping transform the world over, they're not just giving them solar panels or hydropower or a hospital. They are giving them the tools that they need to develop themselves in the way that will make them modern on their own terms.
Yeah, that's so powerful because I'm just thinking now of, I used to have a friend, and every year she goes on a volunteering trip to Africa. And it's just like she and the other sort of like American volunteers will go to Africa, go to this little village and do some sort of work there. I don't know if it's building a schoolhouse or installing I don't know what it is that they do, but she just comes back and she's just like, oh, every year it's so meaningful to me to like help the children and connect with the community and learn to be selfless and to give. And I'm just like, well, you spend a lot of money like flying there and your labor is probably not super skilled. Maybe it would have been better if you just took the money and gave it to the people. And I never said that to her because I didn't want to be an asshole. But I can't help but think that a lot of the aid that the West gives to Africa or to do poverty or alleviation or other NGO programs, like nothing will make as much impact on the community as a road or as a hospital or something that China's just like, here, this is what I would want in your place. And, without the sermons, without the interference in how they do things, I think it's actually tremendously respectful because it's just saying, I don't know what's best for you, but I know this will help you. Let's help.
I don't want to bash the United States too much, but let's talk about U.S. aid. Firstly, not all U.S. aid it's very different from the way that China has been doing aid. A lot of U.S. aid is weapons or money for weapons, money to buy weapons from the United States because they say, oh, this is in your interest. You need security. What you need is Apache helicopters. Well, I'm not sure that a developing country's first priority should be buying Apache helicopters. Another part of that is, what we've known as the USAID program, people to come teach Africans about how they should govern themselves. So Americans showing up and, a hotel in a big forum that they pay for where they sit down with Africans and they teach Africans how they should govern themselves and the importance of democracy. And that's a lot of money that has been historically spent on this kind of thing. And a lot of it's been food aid, which is emergency aid. And then you look at, yes, there has been developing and there has been investments and there has been Doctors Without Borders and things like that. I'm not trying to diss everything the United States has done, but you look at China, and China has three kinds of aid that it really does. Emergency aid, which is similar to U.S., actual useful aid, where it's food or water, tents and that kind of thing, and hospital clinics, temporary clinics, and doctors that come from, whether it's the military or private institutions and universities, which is similar to some of the U.S. aid. But China doesn't come in and tell you how to govern yourself. They don't give you conferences on self-governance or the importance of democracy or the importance of communism. None of that happens. But what China does is these other two kinds of aid, and we've talked about them. One is called China-aided projects, where China pays for things, and the other one is finance financing where they remove the liberal hand from the internal and development of those countries. I mean, if you are an African, you or someone in Kazakhstan, you aren't thinking, you know what, I really need some, preachy Americans to come here and tell me how to run my country. What you're thinking is like, they're sick people, we need a hospital, and I think that China's kind of aid under the Belt and Road Project is the kind of aid that actually changes lives.
Fantastic. Well, Jason, let's wrap it up with a little bit of your thoughts about the future, because we're living through very, very tumultuous times. When I first kind of had my change of heart about China, a lot of the ideas that I was saying was considered outlandish, or, they will say, hey, Angelica, why did you start talking about third world is slop? Well, it's becoming more and more mainstream. It's becoming more and more accepted that this is what's happening. We're moving from a America-centered unipolar world to some form of multipolarity, and the institutional moats around global finance that America has very much kept as its own little club is starting to break down. And in addition to geopolitics, we really have to talk about geoeconomy when there are alternatives propping up that are very much centered around BRICS and China. What do you think is going to be the fallout of this current moment that's still unfolding with the Iran war? What do you think? Does China have a role to play in bringing it to a close? And what do you think will the world look like afterwards?
It's a really interesting and good question. I think that I can't, I actually want to answer a different question, but it's very similar.
Go for it.
It's a parallel question, because I'm not Gordon Chung. I don't have.
You don't have a crystal ball.
Right, exactly. I don't.
You're not going
to
pretend
tarot cards and say,
no, you don't.
The world is going to be like this. These countries are going to collapse. But what I am going to say is what we ought to do.
Okay.
It is, as an American, it is in the best interest of America to leave Iran alone. It is in the best interest of America to cooperate with Chinese companies in a variety of ways that are beneficial for the United States. It's beneficial for China, but we're not going to talk about that because it's not necessary. Americans don't care. But what Americans do care about is themselves. And so I'm going to point this out for the Americans watching, or the Westerners watching. If you're watching from Germany, watching from the UK, if you're watching from Canada, the United States, all of these Western entities, working with China is in your interest. There's a factory in Ohio called Invenergy USA, and it is a joint venture between a Chinese company and an American company, and they use Chinese technology and American workers. They provide 600 American workers with jobs making solar in America by Americans, for America, and for export. This benefits America. This benefits us to work with Chinese companies. Now, some of the Americans watching are going to say, oh, no, we can't have Chinese people setting up factories wherever they want in the United States. Okay, calm down. What we could do is what China did and set up special economic zones. So you don't want them close to some U.S. base that you think is particularly important. Fine. Well, let's choose areas in your state, district, or town where we say, hey, this is a great place for you to set up a factory. And have Chinese companies set up factories in the United States with American companies. It's called a joint venture, a JV. And we can work together with Chinese companies, with Chinese technology to provide American jobs, to provide American goods for the American community or for export. This is in our interest. Or set up more factories in China. There are plenty of special economic zones in China where American companies can set up and work in China with Chinese highly skilled labor to produce goods in China for export, which would also benefit U.S. shareholders and U.S. investors. There's no reason that we can't have a good, healthy relationship with Iran, with China, with other countries around the world. We need to choose peace. We need to choose cooperation. We need to choose a Beijing slogan, working together to build a shared future for all of us, all humanity.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The real Thucydides trap is the one inside America's head. And the way to get out of it is not to contain China. If you try to contain China to get out of the Thucydides trap, you've already entrapped yourself. That's my take on it. And China does not want conflict. So in a way, all that has to happen is for America to not be so paranoid. But I don't know how to explain it in a way that they will actually believe it. But I'm sure you're doing your part to help. I'm trying to do my part. Thank you very much, Jason, for coming on my show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.